Hello everyone, and welcome back to From the Yarra River to the Mediterranean Sea. As always, you are joined by Hannah, that's me. I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia. And we have Itai joining us from Jerusalem. Hello Itai.
Shalom, good to be here.
Before we get into this, I just want to acknowledge that I'm recording this podcast on unceded Wurundjeri land, and I pay my deepest respects to elders past and present. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. We just wanted to start before we get into this episode where we interview Mushon. This is the first episode that we are putting out after having had some big listenership now, which is very exciting. And it feels kind of different to be putting out episodes when we know some of the listeners now. We've had some feedback through emails. And there's a few things that I just wanted to say. And Itai doesn't actually know what I'm going to say at the moment, but I want his input and thoughts on this as well. So the first thing I want to say is that, and Itai, we've both seen this, there's a massive range of people listening to this podcast.
That is very true. We have, 3,000 downloads from Melbourne, and we even have 4 downloads from Gaza, and we have downloads in Dublin, about 1 million there, and a lot in Adelaide and Perth, and so all over the place. Yeah,
all over the place, and lots of different opinions and lots of different knowledge. Some people know so much. Some people have been saying, "Wow, I didn't know any of this," and so I think something that we are aware of, but you guys might not be aware of, is that when we are putting out this podcast, it feels very, very personal to you. And that makes sense because it's a podcast where, talking to you in your ears. But there are some things that might not be for you. And if either Itai say something that you don't necessarily agree with, or you think it shouldn't have been there, I'll give an example. The last episode I gave a trigger warning, and I got a lot of feedback saying, you didn't need to do that. And that's great that there were people that didn't feel triggered. It didn't bring up uncomfortable feelings. And I'm glad that there are people who it didn't. But that trigger warning then wasn't for you. And that's okay. And that's fine. But for us, I kind of just want people to know where we're coming from, that we see a whole lot of different people listening to this podcast, and there are definitely things that you can take from it, and there are things that you don't have to take from it. And I want people to maybe not take everything so personally to them because we're trying to cater to a massive audience.
Yeah, look, you can look at so many objects in so many different ways. It reminds me of those Escher paintings, where you see the woman smiling, or you see her frowning, or and I think reading through the feedback, some people really responding to things we say, and some of the feedback is I feel like they didn't hear the podcast that we made, and I think that's really reflective of so many discussions about Israel and Palestine today, that someone often raises a point and someone responds to a totally different point than what they said because of the lenses that they see the world, and because of their history and because of their education. And so that's fine, and we're doing our best to have an honest personal conversation, and I'll also add that Hannah and I speak to each other probably for twice the amount of time off the podcast than on the podcast, going through what to say, planning, thinking about guests, thinking about how to frame things in a way that would be beneficial to our listeners based on our feedback. So this is the first time I'm doing a podcast, and I've really been moved by a lot of the responses, and I want to thank everyone for that, and to keep listening with an open mind, and to see this as a journey of not just of education, but also a journey into empathy, which is, I think, a big thing that Hannah and I really want to promote with what we're doing with this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And just the other thing that I want to say, and this is more personal for me, and I just want to, put it on the record, and it's just important for me to say it. I got some feedback from the last episode, have been getting feedback since, this war started that, I don't care about Jews. I care more about Palestinians than I do about Jews. On one hand, I kind of don't really care what people say because I know what I feel. But on the other hand, I am doing this podcast and putting it out, and I know a lot of people in the Jewish community are listening to this. And I just want to say categorically that I care so much about the Melbourne Jewish community in particular. It's the community that I grew up in. I care so much about Israel and Israelis. The reason why I'm doing this podcast is because I care so much. And I have learnt so much through Itai and through lots of different sources since this war began. And it's I remember, again, this is another tangent, but I remember when my mum discovered Apple products, and she was just obsessed with Apple products. We used to call her the Apple genius. And because she loved it so much, she just wanted every single person in her life that she loved to have an Apple product. And I have a very similar trait. When I find something that I find really important, I want to share it with all the people that I love. And so all the information that I've learned from Itai, the reason why we're doing this podcast is because I care so much about the Jewish community, and I want them to know this really interesting parts of history that I didn't know. And I want to have these conversations that are uncomfortable and tough because I get so much out of them. And I want the rest of the Jewish community to have those conversations as well.
If I can respond to that, I'd just say, those words remind me of, that famous Elie Wiesel quote, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference." You don't do a podcast about a war that the whole world is talking about and put yourself out there in the way you've done it if you don't care about the people who are affected by that war. And I know, Hannah, you have a giant heart for lots of causes, but also for this cause. And I'm obviously personally involved in this both through my work in the peace building field and also as a person who lives in Jerusalem and is married here, raising 2 children here. But yeah, I think you care about this place a lot more than a lot more people know, and I think it's really important that people know that. As we begin our conversation today. So who's our guest for today?
So we have Mushon Zer Aviv today. I hope everyone's done their homework and read his article, "Your Empathy is Killing Us." If not, pause and go and read it. It's in the show notes from last week. And it's a very interesting conversation. It's very heartfelt. Mushon is, clearly feeling a lot from this war. And it was really great to chat to him. And after that, we have a conversation between Itai and me about how we feel the left has, what would you say?
It's a response to the global left, to both, some prominent feminists in Australia, but to the left on the American university campuses. And we have discussion about some of the responses to what's happening now. Keep in mind, this podcast episode was recorded on the 7th of December, and I know a lot has changed since then. And yeah, we hope that you'll find Mushon interesting. And then I'll add the following week, we're also going to have a colleague of mine who works in the peace building field, Lana Al-Kalan, who is a Palestinian woman from Jerusalem. And like Mushon, she's also very much involved in peace and dialogue programs, and she's going to give her perspective. So consider the episode 4 and 5 a pair, and listen to them together. And hopefully, as always, the slogan of our podcast, we hope that these conversations both comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. So enjoy.
Perfect. So we're so pleased to have our first guest on the show. Can't believe it sounds very professional that we have a guest. It's Mushon Zer Aviv. He's an Israeli designer, educator, researcher, and peace activist. And he wrote an article that many of you would have read a few weeks ago called "Your Empathy is Killing Us: Why Binary Partisanship in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict is Hurting Both Sides and What to Do About It." And yes, he joins us over Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us, Mushon.
Thank you for having me.
So do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, and how you came to hold the views that you do about war and peace, which are somewhat different than probably most of the Israeli mainstream.
Yeah. I design digital interfaces, and I design maps. A lot of my work involves data. Some of my work involves artificial intelligence, as it's often called. So very technological designer in that sense. A lot of my work involves maps, and that also got me quite involved in looking at the maps that I grew up with, maps that fail to explain to me the very basic fact of where do I live, right? So I grew up in the late 70s, 80s, around maps that presented Israel before 67, after 67, with Sinai, without Sinai, with the Golan Heights, without the Golan Heights, like all, and growing up, I was like, at some point in school, they taught us where Israel is, and I probably didn't listen, and it's probably my fault, and it stayed like that for a long time as this thing that I was supposed to know but I don't know, and I ended up reflecting on that quite late in my life and realizing that it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault that I don't know where my country is, what are the boundaries of my country. I know for you guys, Australians, it's easier.
Much bigger spot on the map. You can't miss it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like, just keep walking. When it gets wet, you're off.
Yes.
I was approached by the Tel Aviv municipality, and they actually had Tel Aviv, as you know, is a pretty progressive city, and the municipality is pretty progressive as well, and they realized that the maps that are used in school books and some of them are hanging on the walls, represent an Israel that never existed, an Israel that it completely ignores the occupation and kind of a speculative Israel that annexed the West Bank, and beyond the political meaning of it, it's bad education. So they contacted me, asking me to design a new map that would be presented on every wall in every class in Tel Aviv. And we worked on that for 2 years, and then COVID happened, and the funding went away. And we didn't give up, and we,
what a shame.
Yeah, the municipality actually ended up funding all of the project on its own.
I was a teacher at the school where Hannah was, and I used to teach Israel studies. And the school also had a policy that every class had a map in the room, and all the maps we got were from the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, because they give free maps, and none of them had a green line. And I asked the library, I said, "Can you order in maps with a green line?" And they were like, "Where do we order them in from?" Like who is, because all the Jewish agency, the JNF, Magen David Adom, everyone that provides maps to schools doesn't provide them with a green line. So I remember I got a giant map for my classroom because I needed it to teach, and then I physically had to get a green marker and, like, in every room I was in, like, draw the green line onto the map because I didn't want the kids to think that all the West Bank and Gaza is part of a next territory of Israel, which it's not. But there's no map that said that without me having to, physically draw a line on it.
So for us, this is a story of anyone who's actually trying to tell kids the truth about facts, right?
Yeah.
It's not about like a political aspiration. It's about the facts that are not like international law. It's the policy of Israel. Israel has never, there wasn't a single government in Israel, including this most right-wing extremist government that we have right now, that actually annexed the West Bank. So the laws in the West Bank and Gaza are not the same laws are not the Israeli laws. They are a weird extension of military rule. This attempt to experience the world through maps, and the maps that or kind of to force our maps on the world, until the world bows down, has not really worked, and it shouldn't work. And I think what happened with the disengagement of the Gaza Strip, from the Gaza Strip, is that we kind of cropped the Gaza Strip from our map and from our consciousness. And as far as we're concerned, it doesn't exist. We are not occupying it anymore. Like Israelis did not understand or bother to understand much about the blockade of Gaza, or what's happening there, because it wasn't a problem. And yeah, I'm very, very sad to say that it is still a problem, and that problem has exploded in our faces in a way that is just so savage and inhumane and painful, on October 7th. I think the boundary between how we map our reality and where we actually live is really critical.
I want to talk a little bit about your article, which I read and I loved. Itai actually shared it, and that's how I found it. And then I shared it with everyone I knew. And I want to just read out one bit. Is that okay? Can I read out your words in front of you?
Okay. Go ahead.
So it starts with the quote. You quoted Slavoj, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Slavoj Zizek. Right. And he says, "The moment you accept that this is not possible to fight for both sides at the same time, you've lost your soul." And then you go on to talk about a way that you can talk about this war in a way that is inclusive. And I really loved it, and I want to read out that bit. So you talk about having conversations with yes and. So you say, yes, the Hamas attack against civilians in Israel is an indefensible crime against humanity, and nothing can justify the indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza. Yes, the occupation cannot be ignored as the context for this violence, and Israel has the right and the duty to defend its citizens. Yes, IDF bombing causes unproportional damage, leaving Palestinian defenselessness against it. And Hamas continuously shells Israel cities and holds hundreds of civilian hostages. Yes, Hamas cannot be trusted for ceasefire negotiations, and a ceasefire may be the only way to stop the indiscriminate killings and release the hostages. Yes, Palestinians will be forever traumatized by this war, and Israelis will also be forever traumatized by this war. Yes, trust between Israelis and Palestinians is at an all-time low, and diplomacy and trust are required to achieve conflict resolution, security, and justice. So I just loved this so much because I feel like it was a massive part of the conversation that we weren't having. And I wasn't having it. I was trying to hold both of these things, but the way I was having discussions with people was the yes but. And people really hated that. They were like, well, you're justifying it. You can't use the word but without saying you're justifying what happened on October 7th. You're justifying the killings of thousands of people in Gaza. So I just loved it. And since I read that, I've really tried in my conversations to have a yes and conversation and not a yes but conversation. So thank you for writing that.
And I'll add, as someone that works in a peace organization, that we were often trying to have yes and conversations, and they're almost impossible right now because of the polarization. I was also very moved by it, and I'm kind of interested to know, whenever you write an article, you always have an intended audience in mind. Sometimes it's a group of people, sometimes it's just one person. When you sat down to write this, who was the intended audience? Who did you most want to read this first?
For me, the audience was first and foremost the audience that is not in Israel or Palestine. I feel very triggered and very committed towards what's happening here, because as I wrote in the article, it's as well, a part of the way terrorism works. Terrorism works to generate a response, to terrorize, to lead you to to a position where you have to act against it. You have to position yourself against it. And
you were a student at New York University, and I know they've made a lot of very sort of hostile statements about Israel since the war began. Did you also imagine that people at NYU would be reading this? And if so, did you feel like it landed where you wanted it to?
Yeah, so I studied at NYU quite more than 15 years ago, and I have many friends in the US and in the so-called international community, and I saw how they're responding, and I saw from both sides. I saw those who are kind of standing with Israel no matter what, like completely horrified from what happened, and in themselves having a sense of rage and even attempts of vengeance. And on the other side, I saw those who are running to the post-colonial textbooks and trying to latch theories on that, and pretty much calling for the destruction of Israel without even noticing it.
I just want to go back to NYU for a minute. So you say there's the stand with Israel crowd that, Israel can do no wrong, and there's the, decolonize and, Israel shouldn't exist anymore because of its colonial structures or origins. And you're seeing, I guess, a lack of empathy on both sides. But though that lack of empathy is, has hundreds of years of history behind it, and education and narrative that sort of delegitimizes the other side as being, akin to a Nazi almost. How do you generate empathy in, one of the world's most intractable conflicts, and especially within the context of the United States, and especially on a campus like NYU, where everyone wants to have a pure position. Everyone wants to have an ideologically 100% environmentalist, feminist, LGBT rights, etc. Like, nuance is not really a thing that you look for on university campuses these days. So how are you hoping to find that?
Very huge question. So I'm not actually looking for more empathy. I think, and I wrote about that a bit in the article, that psychologist Paul Bloom, who wrote very a very provocative book called Against Empathy, argues that the way that empathy works is as a spotlight. So, and the light beam of that spotlight is very, very narrow. And in fact, the studies have shown that under the light of that spotlight, we can often put only one person, and then we can empathize with that one person, and that empathy is very, very powerful. And it's pretty sure that most of our socialization and most of our ideas about society and about kin, about being in groups is starting from that point, but the scaling is actually very, very complex, because when the spotlight is shedding its light on the one, it also leaves the many in the dark.
So, Hannah and I grew up in Australia, which is not a very nationalistic country. Very few people have Australian flags outside their house. If you do, you're probably quite right wing. Australians don't get excited about, maybe around sport we do, but like generally, it's a very live and let live society. Unlike, Israel and Palestine, which are deeply nationalistic, and also even within, Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, or between West Bankers and East Jerusalemites, there's tensions. We have a lot of tribal differences, and we accentuate our differences a lot through food, through culture, through language, through politics. Even our political system here, we have, every identity has its own school system, it has its own political party, it has its own newspaper. There isn't like one newspaper that the whole country is reading. Like it's very divided in that sense. And to me, that's one of the strengths of living here, because I think that all those things makes your identity much richer and much stronger, and gives you a greater sense of meaning and purpose. But it also causes a lot more conflict. And something I noticed really starkly now listening to you, I just went back and looked at the article. On the front, you've got a map on the top of the article, and it's a map of the Middle East. Maybe it looks like a photo from space. There's no borders on it. There's no labels on it. You can't see Jordan and Egypt and Syria and Palestine. It's just like a red square over what looks like an aerial photo. And I was like, no one draws the Middle East without lines. And you've done something here which is really interesting. You've said this is the region, and I'm going to take all the lines off it, and then I'm going to write about empathy. But how do you square that with the fact that the vast majority of people here, the first thing when they look at this map that you drew beautifully without lines, is the lines, is the walls, is the borders, is the checkpoints, is the separations, is the the state of Tel Aviv and the state of Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza and area A, B, and C. And how do you take the lines off that?
How do I take the lines off the map is pretty much the question that I have on my mind since I'm little, right? Being secular and with a kind of a more international perspective about the world and about kind of an internationalist perspective, looking at myself first as human, way before I see myself as a Jew or even as an Israeli. I failed to acknowledge how deep my cousins see their connection to the land, and how deep it's ingrained into their everything. And it was really hard for me to give up on the idea of separation, of saying we need to draw borders on the map. We need to say this is where the Palestinians would be and this is where the Israelis would be, and that's it. We don't see each other anymore. And when I came across A Land for All, Two States, One Homeland, which is a movement that is promoting an updated version of the two-state solution, I was quite skeptical, because what two states, one homeland mean is that, yes, there will be two states between the Jordan and the sea, and you'll be able to live wherever you want. You'll be able to work wherever you want. You'll be able to worship wherever you want. You will be able to travel wherever you want. It's a confederation of the two states with borders, but open borders. Borders that are not meant to push each other away, but borders that are about administrating how we share the land, how we do it together. Now, if at the beginning I've heard that, I was like, oh, that's a nice idea, but it's just so like, what are they talking about? But then, if we would have talked about that 80 years ago, and we would have spoken about the border between Germany and France, and saying, oh, Germans will be able to live in Paris and French would be able to live in Berlin, and come and go wherever they want, it would have been like, what are you talking about? But it happened, and we take it for granted because the borders that we draw on maps are not as strong as we are, as our desires and our real possibility to see ourselves in each other beyond these borders. The empathy circles are bounding us, but we've found ways to play with that. We've found ways to play with identity, and not by drawing and saying you are there, and that's it. There are ways for self-determination. And I think we need self-determination, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. Palestinians need the opportunity to find out, what does it mean to be a Palestinian that is sovereign? What does it mean to be a Palestinian that is not under occupation? And Israelis deserve, finally, the opportunity to understand, what does it mean to be a Jew, an Israeli Jew, that is not constantly afraid for their lives?
Who do you see as the indigenous people of this country, and does that question matter to you even?
That question, I wouldn't say that question doesn't matter to me, because I think one of the things that I've understood is that both people are indigenous to this land. Both people are indigenous to this land. This is critical. My roots go back at least 10 generations in Palestine. The fact that I do not see myself as belonging to the land, but I also don't see the land as belonging to me. I see people, and I see people that are trying to live in a region that is small and is soaked with blood and with meaning and with this spiritual meaning and with faith and with hope. And of course, this is not something you just give up on. This is not something that you forget about. This is not something you just say, oh, just go to one of the other Arab countries, or just go back to Europe or to North Africa, in my case, where you came from. And that's the problem that I have with where much of the discussion about who's indigenous and who's the colonizer is leading. It's not relevant to what we have here. We are not the French in Algiers. Like, everything in what makes us who we are is about our connection to this land as Jews. And everything about what the Palestinians are is about their connection to this land as Palestinians. And they have the roots. And it's not important for me to ask whether they were, they saw themselves as a national body, or they were just a couple of people working their lands and growing up at the shade of the olive tree and realizing that the olive tree was there when their grandfather was their age. That is connection to the land.
Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful point to end on, this notion of we don't own the land owns us. And I think both Israeli and Palestinian people, from the connection to the olive trees and to walking in the Mediterranean Sea and swimming there, and so much of this land shapes our national symbols, our culture, the way we are. And Halevai, inshallah, maybe one day we'll see this place in that way, and we'll share this land in peace. And on behalf of Hannah and I, we really wanted to thank you so much for your time and your insights and your honesty and your commitment to, creating a different tomorrow for this place. So hamon to that.
Thank you. It's and I appreciate the support, and it's never been harder to do that. But we need the international community. We need Jews around the world to reframe their connection to Israel in a way that is really committed to what Israel is about. It's supposed to be about.
So, Itai, that was a really interesting talk with Mushon. I definitely learned a lot about the maps. Didn't know any of that. Didn't even realize that was going to come into the conversation. So that was super interesting. And I especially thought something that he said that was really interesting. He said something like, Palestinians feel so connected to the land, and the land doesn't belong to them. They belong to the land. So that really reminded me of Indigenous Australians and how they see the land of Australia. They, or at least what I understand from people I've spoken to and things that I've read, that they also feel that way. And I think it's interesting that my mind went there, because I have at times been critical of the Australian left in the pro-Palestinian movements being so connected with Indigenous Australians. And I'm not sure whether I've understood why they're so connected. But I wanted to ask you, why do you think Indigenous Australians are so connected to the Palestinians right now?
So before I answer that question, I just want to reflect on sort of what I learned when I was growing up, and then I want to get to that. So when I was growing up, I remember in grade 5 at school we had this thing called Colonial Day, where we all had to dress up as British sailors, and we sang Toralay Oralay Adati, and we bounced Botany Bay and drank tea, and and this like, Aboriginal man came and did like a fire, lighting a fire with sticks and threw a boomerang, and it was all like very, Orientalist, but for Aboriginal, and like I was like, that was what I remember growing up. I had a very sort of education that was a very white centric history, which is very different, I think, to what people learn today. When I was in year 8, I remember the Mabo decision happening in 1992, and then sort of a lot of us at school sort of starting to talk about this, saying, "Oh wow, there's a whole story. This whole terra nullius thing is bullshit." And it was a real wake up call. And then in year 12 in BCE with the cats, like we started writing about Wick and the influence of the Mabo decision. And I think for me that was a real wake up call that within my lifetime, I guess children have gone from learning almost nothing about Aboriginal people or the first Australians, as they're now called, to now it being a very central part of people's identity and knowledge. And there was a lot of sort of unlearning and learning I did on that journey. And then as a teacher, I introduced a subject at the school I was teaching that would specifically focus on teaching Australian history through the eyes of the first Australians, because I felt like that was something really important. And I led several trips to Kamaruganja through the Yorra Yorra Biachad program. And I think one of the things that most struck me sort of through that process was this film I watched called The Secret River, which is based on a book by you've seen it or you've read it.
I read it. We did that for year 12. I still think about it all the time, The Secret River.
Yeah, and it's like this, even though it's fiction, it's based on a true event that happened around the Hawkesbury River. And you see how that process happened of this guy coming from England, William Thornton, I think is his name, and then like going into the land thinking the land belongs to me, because I came on this ship and I bought the land and I feel connected to it. And then sorry to ruin the ending, but the ending of the book and the film ends with this massacre of
Yeah.
of dozens of black people, that's he feels is done in an act of self-defense. And then from there I started learning about the frontier wars and the many massacres that happened that are not really memorialized in the public imagination of Australia. I think many people can name the Coniston, the places of many massacres. They're not really well known. Maybe there's little half a statue in some of these places. And then beyond that, like through the early 2000s, as a Jew, I was always taught that Jews and Indigenous people, like we with each other, we're on the same team. I learned the William Cooper story, how he spoke up about Kristallnacht, and we have to return the favor. And then there was like Mark
There were
Lieber.
protests.
Yeah.
I remember being taught, we were taught at school during the Holocaust that, there were so many people who didn't speak up, and there were all these Indigenous Australians marching in the streets in Melbourne saying like, this needs to stop. And we were always taught like, Jews and Indigenous Australians are so connected.
Yeah. And then I think, look, throughout the early 2000s, I think Jews were maybe disproportionate in the Indigenous rights movement. Mark Lieber, Ron Kasten, Sandra Bartis, like many others. And I often would read a lot of their articles and writings, and there would often be this connection of we were exiled from our land, thousands of years ago, and we long to return, and we maintain that connection. And you have also been pushed off your land because of the reservations and all of the policies of the early 1900s. And now like you also want to return, and you're connected, and song lines, and comparing that to stories from the Talmud. And it was like a really compelling story for me. And then I had this sort of wake up call that like, what, I only know half the story here. And I think it first really occurred to me actually last year when the whole Sydney Festival thing happened. Do you remember the boycott issue of it? It was an Israeli dance troupe that was meant to perform at the Sydney Festival, and like dozens of artists then withdrew their performances from the Sydney Festival in objection to the fact that it was sponsored by the Israeli embassy. This specific dance they'd given $20,000 sponsor this. And what was interesting for me was reading the statements of many of the artists, including the Indigenous artists and the non-Indigenous artists, and all of them said, we withdrawing because we feel like we can't say that we care about Indigenous people and then be performing in an event that's sponsored by the Israeli embassy. Like those two things don't go together. It's like fire and water. We can't be involved in that. And I think for a lot of Australian Jews, then that raised the question of why can't an Indigenous artist or rapper or painter or why can't they be involved in events sponsored by the Israeli embassy? And I know not all Indigenous people feel the same way. There's obviously, I think, people on, like Senator Lydia Thorpe and Baraka and Celeste Little and Gary Foley, Amy McQuay, who very much have this colonialism, being the same between Palestinians and Indigenous people, have very strong solidarity. And then there's people like, Warren Mundine and Marsha Langton and Nova Peris who, get, I think, more of the Jewish argument and don't want the Aboriginal cause being sort of lumped in with the Palestinian cause, because they feel that as First Australians, their story is very different, and that they're shocked by Hamas and they don't want to in any way be associated with anything that could be seen as justifying any of the actions or the way that they struggle for liberation, because they feel like the Indigenous struggle for liberation was very different. And then beyond that, something I've really noticed now in all of the rallies is that in every Zionist or Jewish rally that happens in Melbourne, there's a lot of Israeli flags and also a fair few Australian flags. And in every Palestinian rally, there's a lot of Palestinian flags, and a lot of Indigenous flags. And you never see...
I've seen that a lot.
And you never see an Australian flag at a pro-Palestine rally, and you never see the red, yellow, and black Aboriginal flag at a Zionist rally. And it's really interesting as why is there the absence of the other flag? And I think my theory is, and I'd be interested in your take on this, I think the reason why I see so many Aboriginal flags in Palestinian rallies is because there's a sense of we are Indigenous, you are Indigenous, so these two flags go together. And I think in many of the Zionist rallies, there's a sense of we care about Israel, but we also care about Australia. And there's a strong need to show that I am connected to Australia, no less than I'm connected to Israel. I'm not disloyal to this country. And so that's why I have to have the Australian flag, in a prominent place on the stage or waving it with me. And I think that's why that phenomenon exists.
So interesting. So I think one of the things where I see the Palestinian movement and solidarity with Indigenous people or Indigenous Australians is this kind of feeling of like, no one is free until Palestine is free. And there's a chant, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. That's a chant that's chanted at the rallies. And I never really understood that. I was kind of like, I don't get what this means. I think now I understand what it means is that any oppressed person or group of people will feel solidarity with any other group of oppressed people because we know what it feels like. Yes. Palestinians aren't Indigenous Australians, but they see that Indigenous Australians have struggled and continue to struggle for, equality in Australia. And so they say, we see your struggle. It's different to ours, but we see it and we understand it. And so we're going to fight for... Indigenous people say, we're going to fight for you because we understand how it feels. I think that's my take on it. Same as like, go on.
No, it's interesting you say that because, in the anti-apartheid struggle, South African Jews were disproportionately arrested more than any other group, fighting against apartheid, even though some of the mainstream community supported apartheid, until the late 80s.
I think that's the same thing.
And then also in the US, like in the civil rights movement, there were many Jews, very actively involved in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. Abraham Joshua Heschel being probably the most prominent of them, really also as a statement of we feel this oppression and so therefore we need to speak out. Yeah.
Well, I think that's why these the pro-Palestinian rallies at the moment are so jarring for me, because Jews have been oppressed forever. Like we have been oppressed, and that's why Jews have been so involved in other people's struggles, because we say, yeah, we know what it feels to be oppressed, and so we're going to fight really hard for other people. And there are so many Jews. I think there was I need to get the statistics, but I think when the Voice referendum happened, proportionately Jewish suburbs all voted yes, because we understand.
Yeah, like McNamara.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting to me about the progressive left at the moment, is that part of their whole movement is no one is free until everyone is free, but except for the Jews. The Jews right now are the oppressors, and so they're not involved in this conversation. And that's so hard for me and people like you as well, who are saying, yeah, we not in our name either. We don't want this to be happening. We don't want the Palestinians to be suffering the way they are. But can we please be in this conversation as well? Because we have been oppressed. Can you please understand that and take us along and put us in your "we are not free until everyone is free" category, because we have been oppressed. But on the other hand, and I want to talk to you about how
Hold on,
oppressed are. Yeah.
I just want to say something on that. I think for many, people on the left in Australia, I say this especially in the Greens, and I'm saying this as a former member of the Greens, I think there's a very strong sort of binary thinking that makes you choose between A or B. So it's either Israel is the oppressor and Palestinians are the oppressed. Israelis are white and Palestinians are brown. Israelis are interlopers and Palestinians are indigenous. But I don't think any of these binaries are completely true, because in a lot of cases it's both A and B. So for example, it's true in Gaza that the Palestinians are oppressed and the Israelis are the oppressed. I'm very aware of that, and that is something that should stop. That is wrong. But it's also true that on October 7th, it's Hamas that was the oppressor, and Israeli Jews and Arabs that were killed and kidnapped, that were the oppressed. It's true that Israel is a Western country, and that it feels, Tel Aviv feels a lot more like Sydney than it does feel like Amman. I get that. But it's also true that most Israeli Jews are of Mizrahi heritage, and myself, my parents, my mother was born in Iraq. So to say that we're all white, I think is missing a huge part of the story. And it's also true that Zionism used elements of colonialism to establish itself in Palestine, which we spoke about in the last episode. But then it's also true that Jews are indigenous to the land, and there's archaeology and history that shows we've been here for thousands of years. So, this whole notion of that nothing is either A or B, that there is a complexity that I think you and I can see, and I feel like a lot of the hard left in Australia sometimes misses that.
That reminds me of something that I posted on Instagram in the very early days on 26th of October. It feels like a long time ago. But it's from the book Jews Don't Count by David Badial. I'm sure you've read it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have.
So he writes, Jews are the only objects of racism who are imagined by racists as both low and high status. Jews are stereotyped by racists in all the same way as other minorities are, as lying, thieving, dirty, vile, stinking, but also as moneyed, privileged, and powerful, and secretly in control of the world. Jews are somehow both subhuman, but also humanity's secret masters. The left pause before putting Jews in their sacred circle of minorities who need protection, because all the people in the sacred circle are oppressed. And if you believe, even a little bit, that Jews are moneyed, privileged, and powerful, then you can't put them into the sacred circle of those who are oppressed. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, anti-Semitism is, the way I describe it, it's a conspiracy theory. And it can go in so many ways. It can be that, against George Soros, that, Jews are on the left and control, the make America, kind of love immigrants and minorities, and that's destroying America, which is a trope you very much hear on the American right. And then it can also be that Jews are conservative and get America to support Israel and bomb Gaza and all of that sort of thing, because and it's like, yeah, depending on the day, you can choose which conspiracy theory you want, and you'll find a Jew to fit into that. And that's why it's a very, very anti-Semitism's been around for a very long time, because it sort of morphs and changes from generation to generation. That's why it's a very hard thing to fight. And I think we could probably do a whole episode on anti-Semitism, so I won't get into now what I think Jews do right and wrong in the way we respond to anti-Semitism. But I definitely think that's why I think this war has made so many Jews feel uncomfortable. And I actually wanted to ask you a question about that, which is, where do you feel at home? Like, throughout this war, I know many Australian Jews have been talking about, feeling uncomfortable in Australia. And has this made you question at all, not physically where you want to live, but more ideologically, what does home mean for you?
Well, I have been thinking about this a lot. Again, like, I think I'm only speaking for myself here, because I'm actually kind of struggling to relate to many young Jews at the moment about that question. Like, I think my answer to that question is going to be really different to a lot of Australian Jews. So I'll try and talk about both, because I think I understand the other side as well. But for me, like, home is Melbourne. Home is like Abbotsford, where I live. I wake up in the morning, I go get my coffee from the corner, I chat with my amazing neighbours who I love, I have a coffee with my housemate, and I feel like so at home. And it's been jarring to see that the people who I have on all other issues been in solidarity with, I don't feel like I have been incorporated into the conversation. Like I was saying before, I haven't been to rallies, and that's because I don't feel like there's a space for me. That doesn't mean that I don't see Australia as my home. I do still feel at home here, and the anti-Semitism piece hasn't made me feel unsafe to be here, but it hasn't made me feel welcome at times. But interestingly, I have seen a lot of Jews say they don't feel safe here, and they feel safer in Israel, where statistically it's, you said it in another episode, like statistically it's, unsafer for Jews to be in Israel right now, but Jews still want to be in Israel. And I find that really interesting, because I'm not sure that that's always been the case. Like, before this war, like, yes, Jews feel very connected, or Melbourne Jews feel very connected to Israel, but, people aren't making Aliyah all the time. There are some people who do go and make Aliyah, but, the majority of people in Australia love going to visit Israel, but they would never live there. But I feel like now, if you ask them that question, many people would say, I feel more at home in Israel than I do in Australia. And I do find that very interesting, and I can't relate to that. So maybe you have a better understanding.
Yeah, look, I weirdly don't feel home in either place. I'm actually writing a book at the moment. One of the chapters is called "Exile is Home," because I feel like even though I grew up in Australia, I grew up in a Hebrew-speaking Israeli family, so I never really felt 100% Australian. Like, I always felt this thing that I was different, and I think many immigrants in Australia have that experience. And then when I'm here, like, I like customer service, I like waiting in line, I like things to be ordered, and anyone that's been to Jerusalem knows that it's not that here. And so, yeah, often, like, when I'm here, my Australian identity comes out a lot more in many conversations, and especially when I talk about democracy and human rights. And I'm like, it can be different. Like, I've lived in this place where police treat everyone in the same way. You should try that. It's amazing.
Interesting. This is like not relevant, but I don't think police treat people equally in Australia. Just on a completely on a tangent.
I'm comparing it to East Jerusalem, where, like, when I see police or the army, I know that they're there to protect me. And I don't think any Palestinian in East Jerusalem sees the police or army and feels like they're there to protect me. Like that, I think that's what I mean.
Well, I can see,
obviously, I'm not going to get
yeah,
it.
but just back to the beginning of this conversation, like, I can understand also why there is this solidarity between Indigenous Australian people and Palestinians, because when Indigenous Australians see police, I don't think they are there to protect them. It's the same. And so,
sure.
Making that connection as well, just to tie up that end of the conversation, like, I can understand why there is this big solidarity between Indigenous Australians and Palestinians, because there are lots of similarities between how Indigenous Australians are treated by the law, in quotation marks, and by police and by the military in Israel. And on the flip side, like, Jews feel like, oh, what about us? Because Jews in Australia are broadly treated like any other Australian. And that's hard for us because we don't feel like any ordinary Australian. Like, on one hand, we're like treated the same, but we don't feel the same. And we want to be treated the same, but we want to have differences. Like, being a Jew is actually really, it's very confusing.
Yeah, I think as a Jew, you want to be, in a way, both the insider and the outsider. You want the premier to wish you a happy Hanukkah and come to your Sukkot and Pesach events and those sorts of things. But then you also want to feel like an ethnic minority, and Melbourne has Afghani, Indian, Sudanese, many ethnic minorities, and I think Jews want to see themselves as part of those ethnic minorities, because we do have special foods and special festivals and a special language and all of these sorts of things, and there's that constant tension between wanting to hold your sort of outsider status and want to be an insider. And I think if you look at where Jews live in the world today, like, look at the cities that have the highest Jewish population. So places like New York, Toronto, London, Paris, Melbourne, Sydney, these are all cities where over 50,000 Jews live. They're all liberal democracies. Very few Jews live in dictatorships. Very few Jews live in countries where there's one culture and that's it. And I think the reason Jews love living in liberal democracies in sort of some of the capitals I mentioned is because they feel like when there's lots of other minorities, people are going to be more welcoming to people like us. And I think this war has been, for Jews who live in these liberal democratic cities, New York, LA, Sydney, Melbourne, etc., has been like a big wake up call for, like, what does that mean to be a minority when I'm connected to another country on the other side of the world that's done something, and then all of a sudden I'm being held accountable for that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lack of understanding on non-Jews' behalf about everything we just spoke about, how we want to be fitting in with, the mainstream, and also keep our culture and our Jewishness. And there are people who I've seen, like, I'm going to call her out now. I think it's time.
You can do that.
Okay. I want to call out Clementine Ford and Abby Chatfield for not understanding that, and I'm not calling them out for not understanding it, but for not even trying to understand it. Like, I think as someone who is not Palestinian, someone who is not Jewish, you have a responsibility to try and understand what is going on in a much more nuanced way. Part of it, and what, I hear what Clementine says, like, it's not complicated what is happening in Gaza. Understood. I can get behind that. What's happening in Gaza is currently, the response from Israel is not complicated. They're bombing the shit out of them. What is complicated is why they are bombing the shit out of them, what led up to October 7th, why are Australian Jews feeling so invested in this? Why are you not listening to, Jewish voices who may or may not be Zionists? Like, they've just like made up their mind that Zionists are bad, not recognizing that, 70 to 90%, I'm not exactly sure, of Australian Jews would call themselves Zionists. Like, how is it possible that every single Australian Jew is a demon and a Nazi? And like, it's just not. Like, I just think that they're missing our voices. our voices who feel Jewish, who feel connected to Israel, who don't agree with what is happening, and they're just silencing our voices. And I feel really let down by it.
The issue of voice is really interesting. I actually remember during the last Gaza war, there was a Q&A episode that generated a lot of controversy because they talked a lot about Israel and there was no Jewish member on the panel, even though there were voices that were Zionist. And a lot of Jews said, how could you talk about Israel and not have our voice there on this panel? And this war, there was a Q&A episode that did have a prominent Jew speaking on it. But I think, I think we feel as Jews that any conversation about Israel, we should be there. And Palestinians feel like any conversation about Palestine, they should be there. And I think there's a lot of conversations that happen in Australia that don't involve, either exclude Zionist voices or exclude Palestinian voices, and or raise one up above the other, and then claim to be somehow objective when they don't do that. And I know, in many Jewish spaces, it's almost impossible to invite Palestinian speakers these days. I know it happens a little bit, but it's not mainstream, unless it's like, a very Zionist Palestinian, which some of them exist. Hello, Yosef Haddad. But like and the same Palestinians, if they invite Jews, they will only invite, anti-Zionist Jews. They will never invite, a Zionist Jew, because I don't think a lot of these advocacy groups, they're not really interested in dialogue or in understanding the narrative of the other. They're interested in advocacy. And so, one of the best forms of advocacy is to say, here, look, I've gotten an Arab to say all these wonderful things about Israel or Palestinians. I've gotten a Jew here to say all these wonderful things about Palestine. Therefore, I've proved my point. And obviously those people exist and they should be platformed. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be invited to speak, but like they may be a 5 or 10%, whereas a lot of Arabs in Israel do experience racism and discrimination because they're not Jewish. Even like Druze who are currently, fighting in Gaza and dying with the people of Israel because they are Arabic speakers, still their villages, their communities don't have the same services and access and roads and hospitals and all of these sorts of things that Jews have. And they've been raising, if you read, interviews with Druze soldiers, they're still raising these questions during the war. Like, how could we, we with you, in this struggle, obviously, because it's our struggle too, but like, why is there still a Jewish nation state? Or, why do these things still exist? So, I think all of these layers of complexity are not very good for advocacy. And that's why I don't, do advocacy. I do peace building, which is very, very different. Because I
actually don't think it is different. I think peace building is the best form of advocacy. And I think that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. I think we are advocating doing this podcast through peace building. That is like, I've been thinking a lot about advocacy lately and feeling like both sides are doing it wrong because there's not enough peace building. It's ironic to me that Clementine Ford says, I want peace, but wants to leave out an entire part of the conversation. Same as like many Jews saying, yeah, of course we want peace, but they don't want to talk to any Palestinians or they feel scared by Palestinians. Yeah. Like, I think the best way to advocate is by saying, yeah, we want peace and this is how we're going to do it, by seeing both sides.
Right. Look, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone that's been talking about this war that will say, I don't want peace, no matter what their political view. It's just that peace means like a lot of very, very different things. But I guess I'm coming from the perspective where I don't see peace as a win-lose option, which is where I think that probably makes me in a minority. Like, I don't think peace needs to mean that one side completely destroys the other side. I think peace is a process that's messy. It's a process that takes many, many years. It's a process that involves compromise. It's a process that means giving up on a lot of very foundational beliefs. And it's ultimately about, finding a way to share this land where everyone has, the same rights, justice, and equality. And that is not what most people think peace means. I think most people think here, when they talk about peace, they mean the other side basically 100% accepting their narrative and then, dealing with it, suck it up, like, we are Indigenous, suck it up, or this is going to be a free Palestine, suck it up, like, without realizing that, I say this every episode, but there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Arabs between the river and the sea right now, and neither of us are leaving. And so if your peace involves the complete subjugation of one side or the other side, then that's not peace.
And look, I think that way of thinking, seeing from both sides, is important for everyone to do. But I can understand right now in this current war how hard it is for Jews to do that, and how hard it is for Palestinians to do that. Like, those are the people who are hurting the most right now, and it's going to take time to be able to put that grief to the side and hold the grief of the other. Like, I think it needs to happen, but I'm less critical of the two, oppressed peoples right now, because they're going through it, which is why I'm so critical of people who don't have a stake in this, and the way they're advocating, because I think they have a responsibility to be holding the grief of both sides, and they're not doing it. They're just picking sides, and it's so unhelpful. Like, they are the people who need to be most holding each other's, but everyone's hands through this. And I want to read out a text that my non-Jewish friend, who I've been having many, many conversations with, she's my colleague, Kat, who is just, amazing. And I feel like is really trying to take on the privilege, it is a privilege, and responsibility of trying to hold space for both people, because she doesn't have a stake in it. And so we were talking about, non-Jews, non-Palestinians advocating right now, and why I was feeling let down by them. And she sent me a text that said this. She said, one way I like to think about it sometimes is that if someone is in the group of oppressed people, they shouldn't have to moderate themselves or make their arguments more palatable to try and convince their oppressor that they deserve their human rights. Asking nicely has rarely worked in history. But if you are not part of the oppressed group and have the privilege to speak up, then I believe it is the responsibility of an ally to undertake the emotional labour of advocating, discussing, explaining, researching, and teaching. So on this issue, I think that for me, however I can help be a good ally to both Jewish and Palestinian people, I want to try and do, especially with people who genuinely want to know and want to learn. But I would never expect, for example, a Palestinian to need to argue respectfully to try and convince others of their humanity. And I just am so grateful to Kat for saying that, because it makes me feel like, not everyone on the left is Clementine Ford, as well as she means. Like, I know what Clementine is trying to do, and I agree with a lot of what she's trying to do, but I think there needs to be more Cats out there who are trying to hold space for both of us.
Yeah, I hope that happens. And I think, we were talking before we were recording this about, should we as non-Indigenous people have opinions on Indigenous matters? And I shared with you, offline, that when I actually voted in the Voice referendum from Tel Aviv, and it was such a weird feeling of here I am, an Australian citizen, I'm not Indigenous, I don't even live in the country, but I still have this right to vote. So obviously, took me a day. I went to Tel Aviv. I voted yes, and I wrote about it. But I also felt why do I have this right? Why do I have a right about whether Indigenous people? Surely the only people that should be voting in this referendum are the 3% of Australians who are Indigenous. Because whether it passes or fails doesn't affect me or you in any way. It only affects them, because it's the only laws they can have a voice on is laws that relate to them. And I understand, obviously, there was a split in the Indigenous community between the yes and the no camps, but overwhelmingly, most of them wanted a yes, but then the yes vote didn't happen because they didn't have the majority of the vote. And democracy is sometimes amazing in empowering collective decision making, and it's sometimes terrible. Why should I get a vote on aged care? I'm not elderly. Why should I get a vote on public housing? I don't live in public housing. But that's how democracy works. People get to have a say on a whole lot of things that don't affect them. And I think what your friend Kat is saying, well, if that's the situation already, that you're going to have a say on things that don't affect you, then at least the least you can do is do your research. The least you can do is speak to the people who are affected by whatever decision it is that you have to vote on. and try and center their voices and keep their voices in mind when you vote or advocate or do those things. And I try as best as possible when I have to speak about things that don't affect me to, as much as possible, quote and center the voices of the people who are affected, because I think that's the least you can do. That's the moral thing to do.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I agree with everything you just said. As always, it gets to the end of every episode and I say, yeah, I agree. So next week, we will drop an episode with Lana Al-Kalan. She's a Palestinian journalist and peace builder living in East Jerusalem. I cannot wait for people to hear this conversation. I feel like I was floating for days after speaking with Lana. She's an amazing human, and yeah, that's next week's episode.
Thanks as always for joining us on From the Yarra to the Mediterranean Sea. As always, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please send us an email to fromtheyarra@gmail.com, and we do our best to respond to all of them. And a lot of your feedback, framed our conversation today. So we really appreciate it. And I know this is, for a lot of people, not an easy time to be following this war. It was not an easy week in Jerusalem this week in light of a lot of things that have happened. And we're just sending big hugs to everyone as well. And we hope that we'll see better days.